is a big burden off your shoulders now?
I'm starting to feel a little bit of decompression.
You succeeded a legendary business figure.
If I was going to give anybody advice, it would be to follow a bum.
The financial crisis, 2007, 2008.
You know, I kind of just wanted to say, I want my mommy, right now.
You sold things that were part of GE's history.
We weren't on a path to greatness.
If a president were to say to you, come in as a cabinet officer, what would you say?
I'm not sure business people make great public servants.
Would you fix your tie, please?
Well, people wouldn't recognize me if my tie was fixed, but okay. Just leave it this way. All right. I don't consider myself a journalist, and nobody else would consider myself a journalist. I began to take on the life of being an interviewer, even though I have a day job running a private equity firm. How do you define leadership? What is it that makes somebody tick? After 16 years as the CEO of GE, you've just stepped down. Is a big burden off your shoulders now?
I do think if you're doing the job well, you feel ownership over everybody who's a constituency, and you wear that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, look, I think 16 years is a long time to run one of these companies, and I'm kind of like, I'm starting to feel a little bit of decompression, let's say.
So do you think it's too long to run a publicly traded company for someone like you, or anybody?
It's a great question, David. I think there's a right time and a wrong time, in terms of doing it. So a company our size, you need to run it long enough to make a difference, to be able to shape strategy. And it's always been our philosophy to give a CEO tenure. But at the same time, it's good to get a new set of eyes on these things. As things change, you develop habits. Are you listening as closely as you need to do? And I think, personally, I think, 16 years is probably on the outer edge of how long somebody should be running a company like GE.
So you succeeded a legendary business figure. Was that more of a challenge when you succeed somebody as well known as your predecessor?
Yeah, if I was going to give anybody advice, it would be to follow a bum. It's a lot easier. I remember in 2000, Fortune did a retrospective of the 20th century, and the best manager of the previous 100 years was Jack Welch, right? So you better have some confidence if you're going to take his job, because those were pretty big shoes to fall into. But I loved working with Jack, and I was proud to follow him.
Before you got the job, you grew up in Cincinnati area?
Yep.
And your father was at GE, is that correct? What
Yep.
was his job?
So my dad worked in the aircraft engines business for his whole career, almost 40 years. So I kind of grew up around factories, and I grew up around the technology business, and I had the classic kind of middle class education, high school, public high school, in one of the most Midwestern cities that you can have, okay. Cincinnati, Ohio.
All right, so you were a football star there, is that right?
I was a good athlete. That was really, when I was in high school, if you said, what are you going to do? I would have said, I'm going to be a professional football player, right?
I said that too until I was about 8 or 9 years old, then I realized it wasn't going to work. But you were older than me.
I played a guy. I remember in high school playing against a guy that got a scholarship to Ohio State, and I was an offensive lineman, and I didn't block him once all night. And I said, okay, the NFL career may be out. So I better take care of my math. My math skills may be more important.
But you chose to go to Dartmouth, an Ivy League school, and you played football at Dartmouth.
Played football 4 years at Dartmouth, and that was really how I got there. I was a recruit. I hadn't really thought about going to an Ivy League school. I got to see it through playing football, and that was really my entree into going to college.
So you went to Dartmouth. Were you good enough to be in the NFL after Dartmouth, or you were
maybe as a sideline reporter or something like that?
After you graduated, you went to Procter & Gamble?
I show up at Procter & Gamble my first day, Duncan Hines cake mix, and sitting at the desk right next to me is Steve Ballmer, okay? So Steve Ballmer from Microsoft, Steve and I have been friends since we were 22 years old, and we were horrible employees, I would say. We were like we were like a Dilbert cartoon. We were incorrigible. We would stay up too late at night, all that stuff.
Did he tell you had an offer to go work for this small company in Seattle? Or
Steve tried to describe to me what he was doing, and I said, do you have a backup plan just in case this doesn't work out? Well, Outlook, desktop software, what could that possibly? Who could ever want that?
So you went to Harvard Business School.
Yep.
After Harvard Business School, you went to GE.
Yep.
Now, why did you pick GE?
You know, there was no connection to my dad or anything like that, but I knew GE was a good place to learn and train. And I said, hey, I'm going to go there and stay 5 years, right? And see what happens. So I joined the plastics business when I joined GE, and that kind of just, I was in the field sales and marketing and things like that. And that was really how my career started. I always tell people, like they say, how do you put up with stress? And I said, well, you know, my first job was like selling plastics in places like Detroit. And I would sit in a Shoney's restaurant at breakfast, having dry heaves, you know, getting ready to sell a price increase, walking across the street, saying, oh God, I hope I don't die today. And, you know, on those experiences, great careers are born.
All right, well, it worked out, and you went through a series of
yeah, I did
positions.
classic GE Appliances, GE Plastics, GE Healthcare.
So you're announced as a CEO, and in fact, you took the job, and then a couple days later, 9/11 happens. So what did you think was going to happen at GE or in your career?
Oh gosh, David. So you know, it was an amazing time. You know, and every year when we go through 9/11, I think of the tragedy for the country, which is still very real. At that moment in time, we owned 1,200 aircraft. We owned NBC. We were the biggest business in GE in 2001 was insurance. People don't know that. So we had reinsurance on the World Trade Center. And it was a panic, really. So you know, we went dark on NBC for 3 days. We had to take more than $1 billion write-off.
Dark meaning you had no advertising.
No advertising, right? But the most important thing was what happened in aviation with the leased aircraft. So we would have like nightly calls, and vice chairman at that time was a guy you know, Dennis Darman, who's a great guy. He's since passed away, but I love Dennis. And we would have a teleconference at let's say 9 o'clock at night, and the guys would call in and say, okay, airline X is going to go bankrupt tomorrow unless we buy $1 billion of WETCs. Okay, and I would say, Dennis, what's a WETC? And he'd try to explain it to me, and I'd say, well, what would you do? He said, we got to do it. Okay, let's go, you know? And it was just night after night of this, you know, airline bailout. So we were shutting down airlines around the world because the country hadn't passed terrorism insurance. And so you're making these decisions. So that was like 30 days, right? And then I'm finally thinking, I'm in Fairfield, I'm thinking, okay, the sun's going to rise again. Phone rings. Bob Wright's on the phone. He needs to speak to you right away.
Bob Wright was...
ran NBC in those times. And he said, Tom Brokaw just received anthrax in the mail.
Another infection, this time at NBC News in Rockefeller Plaza.
Rudy Giuliani's in the elevator. They've shut down 16 square blocks around 30 Rock. What do you want me to do? I said, Bob, let me put you on hold just for a second. And just, you know, just like, so that was my first month. You know, that was.
So, well, you got through that. And ultimately, though, a number of years later, another crisis arose, and that is the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And it was very severe.
I went to work in 1982. I became CEO in 2001. If you were an American business person during that period of time, you had never seen a tail risk event. You know, you'd seen recessions and stuff like that, but you'd never seen something that was unimaginable. 9/11 was unimaginable. The global financial crisis was unimaginable. And I think it made all of us smarter about risk. The day Lehman Brothers went bankrupt actually wasn't the worst day of the financial crisis. It was actually the day Washington Mutual went down because all the bondholders got wiped out.
Usually, when somebody goes bankrupt, the equity gets wiped
out,
but bondholders get something.
Right.
Here, the bondholders got nothing as well.
So my CFO came in that day and said, hey, we're going to go raise equity, right? And as much as we can get. We called Goldman Sachs up. We said, okay, what's the largest secondary in the history of the world? And they said, well, in those days, it was maybe $15 billion. I said, okay, we're going to go $15 billion. We're going to do it Monday, right? This was on a Friday. So we have a teleconference with our board on Saturday morning. You know, nobody's there, just my CFO and I, but all the board members are calling and say, hey guys, on Monday, we're going to go raise some equity. You know, you could just hear silence, okay, on the other end of the line. And Roger Penske, who I love, was on the board for a long time. Roger, first guy in, says, let's get the money. So then David roll forward. This was the weekend Washington was voting on TARP. They were desperately trying to find a buyer at Wachovia, and 7 banks went bankrupt in Europe that Sunday morning. And I had to walk from my office to get to 50 people to make the call, do we go the next day? And it was the single most stressful, you know, like I kind of just wanted to say, I want my mommy, you know, right now. Can Can I phone a friend? Can I phone a friend? So I walk in and say, we're not going tomorrow.
Defeat in the House for the massive emergency economic rescue plan.
TARP fails. The market's down 1,000 points that Monday. We waited 48 hours. We raised $16 billion. And that was the moment in time that we were really totally safe.
So you never were worried that GE wouldn't survive?
No.
Okay.
And I think, looking back, David, I think the lesson for everybody in any crisis is the people that move first in uncertainty, that's how, at least in that crisis, that's how you became safe.
Or call your mother if you can, right?
Yeah, exactly.
When you go to Universal Parks now, you can get in free or...
I called the guy that ran it and I said, let's just do a walking tour Universal. I want to see how it works. So we go up, there's a 3-hour line. They put me, I break in the line, I'm in the first seat. They don't let anybody sit with me. And I'm saying, oh my God, I am jerk of the year. I've just been voted the permanent jerk of the year, right?
You inherited a very large industrial conglomerate, you could call it, maybe the largest industrial conglomerate, and then you began to reshape it, and you sold things that were part of GE's history.
Yeah, so if you just go back, we were really a conglomerate. So we went from NBC to pet insurance, jet engines, plastics. We were kind of a classic conglomerate. And I think, in our business, a little bit different than, we're kind of in the permanent hold business, right? So at the end of the day, what I wanted to do was construct around the things that we really viewed as being our core competencies as time goes on, where you can generate a good return, where we could build competitive advantage. We were the biggest provider of long-term care, of reinsurance. I looked at those and said, these are, A, I don't like the industries they're in. B, we're not very good at it, and we run it the wrong way.
Right.
Let's go. So I started chopping away.
GE Appliances, so was that hard to sell?
So again, I always feel like it's good if you're your own activist, and it's always good if you ask yourself the question, do we run this business better than anybody else, or could somebody run it better than we could? In the case of appliances, it was a classic capital allocation because we weren't going to globalize the platform. We didn't want to spend the money to be big in China. We didn't want to spend the money to be big in Africa. I worked in appliances. I wouldn't have been CEO if I hadn't spent 4 years in the appliance business. So I had great affection, and I love the brand. So I had great affection for it, but we were just chopping wood. We weren't on a path to greatness, and we could take that capital and put it in our energy business or aviation business.
What about NBC Universal? Your predecessor bought that business, and it was profitable. And didn't you like hanging out with TV stars and movie stars? And you didn't like that?
So good industry, good team, and we generated a good return for the company in the time we had it. But here was my value added with NBC: make better shows.
So just tell them make better shows.
Make better, as a company, we weren't adding a lot of value. Number one. Number two, you could see the industry was going through this kind of change. So we always did, as a board, strategic reviews of NBC. I think one of our theories of the case in 2010 when we sold it, that really is true today, was we believe that the ability to really preserve pricing power can only be captured by those people that both own the pipes and the content. And we had no interest in owning the pipes, right? So, and three, I would say, unless you're in an existential way willing to go into digital delivery, you're going to get trumped. Now, the one other point I'd make, David, is one I miss completely is the theme park business. A new ride, The Mummy, cost $100 million. You said, how can one ride cost $100 million? I missed it completely. It turned out to be maybe the only business in media that has sustainable competitive advantage is the theme park business. Oh. Because it takes capital, you can build a good spirit in the people and things like that. That was the one I got wrong.
But when you go to Universal Parks now, you can get in free or still, or?
Maybe. So when we bought it, I called the guy that ran it, a guy named Tom Williams, great executive, and I said, let's just do a walking tour Universal. I want to see how it works. We get to the Mummy ride. This is 2003. He said, you want to ride on the Mummy ride? I said, yeah, that'd be great. So we go up. There's a 3-hour line. They put me, I break in the line. I'm in the first seat. They don't let anybody sit with me. And I'm saying, oh my God, I am jerk of the year. You know, I've just been voted the permanent jerk of the year, right? So,
Now, what you tried to do as the CEO of GE was globalize the business, you've said. Well, why would you have to globalize GE? Wasn't it already a very global company?
no. I joined 1982. We were 80% in the United States. By 2001, we were still 70% inside the United States. And what people forget, David, I mean, I think you see it, but you know, the decade of the 90s was kind of the quintessential American decade. I mean, this place was booming. And really, it was easy to kind of grow your companies. So we really weren't, despite the fact we were an old company, we weren't as global as we needed to be. And that was really, I think, one of the central missions of the leadership team over the past 15 years. And I would argue today, we are maybe the best global company of any multinationals in terms of, we're 70% outside the United States. We have a very strong footprint in any country that matters.
Why were the emerging markets so important to you?
Again, arithmetic. I think there's two ways to globalize. One is to go to Washington, D.C. and argue for trade deals, go to Davos and think you can cut a deal. The other way is to hire 10,000 people in a country and say, let's go. Let's go win the customer, let's go. That's always been the approach that we've taken, you know. So I would say we're good in China because we understand the 5-year plans. We built a strong team. We go outside of Shanghai and Beijing to go into the country, and we very much see that every country we're in from the bottoms up.
One of the things you tried to do was to change the culture of GE. What was the culture that you inherited and you were part of, and how did you try to change it, and how successful was it to change the culture?
A company like GE is a study in how do you make scale, how do you make size an advantage and not a disadvantage. Right? Because inherently, size means bureaucracy. There's just nothing, and there's no two ways to get around it, right? So the company I grew up with was very process-driven and very centralized. You could do that because we're basically an American company. But when you're vastly more global, you really can't have people in Boston making a decision for Brazil. You just can't. So we had to become more decentralized, and when you become more decentralized, you have to become more risk-based. So in other words, you ask me to invest in a gas turbine power plant in Nigeria, I say yes. Not because it's safe, but because we're right, we make this much money, and if we're wrong, we lose this much money. You ask me to invest in a nuclear facility in India, I say no. Because if you're right, you make $7 million. And if you're wrong, you lose $7 trillion. You know, so you learn to develop managers that are more risk-based. You put bigger leaders into the field, and I think that's the only way you can survive at the moment in time we live in today.
What would you say are the one or two most important lessons that you got out of being the CEO of GE?
The future always comes, right? Kind of nervous laughter is a bad strategy. So I think this notion that the future always comes.
Why did you want to move your headquarters, and how did you pick Boston?
We were in 570 Lexington Avenue for 40 years, and then we moved to Fairfield, Connecticut. And we moved to Fairfield, Connecticut really because our executives lived in Greenwich, and the taxes were zero. For about 10 years, I wanted to be in a city. I just think there's something, and not that I'm in the office that much, but there's something about being able to walk out your door, see a customer, see an investor, see what's going on, the vibrancy of a city that you don't have. You know, when I would be in my office in Fairfield and I would look out the window, I could see the Merritt Parkway and deer running for their lives as they were crossing. And it was idyllic, it was beautiful, but there was nothing going on, really. Right. And I had an office that was probably as big as the first house I owned. And I could really crawl in that office and just sit there for like 3.5 years. And nobody would ever kind of, is he in there? I don't know. I thought it was important to be in a city, to modernize the company, to be in the flow of ideas. And I wanted to be in a place where we would be important. And Boston's been awesome. I think Boston's a great place. Yeah.
So you're very happy with it?
Yeah, no, look, I think high tech, good schools, a great community. But the thing about Boston that people don't understand, it's got a chip on its shoulder. It's a towny town, you know. Good sports teams, and there's a competitive in-your-face attitude in Boston that I also think is quite healthy for a company.
We'll talk about government. You chaired a presidential task force for President Obama, and you were later on one for President Trump. Do these presidential task force really do very much that anybody can observe?
You know, I think it's always important to serve, but I think in the era we're in right now, it's difficult for a group of business leaders to impact, much.
If a president, President Obama, or the current president, or a future president were to say to you, you have a terrific career behind you, now you should serve your country, come in as a cabinet officer, what would you say?
I would make this comment with trepidation to say, I'm not sure business people make great public servants. Now, I said that before President Trump, but I was honored to serve President Obama, and I would watch my colleagues, and I think, guys like you and me, we're used to saying, here's what you should do. Do this. The nature of that process is, here's what I would do if I were you, right? Here's what I would do. Here's the way I would do it if I were you. And we're not always that good at context. And unless you get context, I think it's hard to really understand all the dynamics of public service.
When you're the CEO of GE, it's very intense. So what do you do to relax?
I really feel blessed in that I basically like my family. I like my wife. It's amazing. I always say.
You find that unusual in the business world?
Yeah, I said, look, I've led a simple life. One wife, one daughter, one company, right? And I use that line when we acquired Alstom. It was in Paris. And I use that line to describe myself. I lead a simple life, one wife, one daughter, one company. I said, I realize that's not the French way, but it's worked for me. But I like to read. I like playing golf. I like to read. I actually like hiking. But I think one of the things that I've trained myself is I've always been able to lead in the moment. So I've always been able to kind of separate different things, even though there's pressure. In 2011, the Fukushima nuclear disaster took place, and a couple of the reactors were ours, and it was terrifying, I would say. So I was on a 2-hour teleconference on hey, we don't know what's going on. All we can see is the CNN helicopter feed, but if something happens to the reactor, this is horrible. 2-hour teleconference. I'm in Perth, Australia. Click. I have to go to a town hall with 1,000 people. So I have to walk 20 steps, and I'm going from the world as we know it is ending to kind of walk in and say, hey guys, I'm feeling good today. Everything's groovy, right? Everything's cool. We're gonna get through this and things like that. And I think good leaders know how to be in the moment, intense, but compartmentalized. And I've always been able to do that in my personal life as well.
What would you say are the 1 or 2 most important lessons that you got out of being the CEO of GE?
The future always comes, right? So the notion that I hope this doesn't happen, that's a bad, kind of nervous laughter is a bad strategy. So I think this notion that the future always comes, live in markets. Look, if you're in the healthcare business or the aviation business in 2000 and you turn your back on, if you're a business person today and you turn your back on China, you're crazy. And then give fully of yourself. Give. Every person that works for you is their own story. They have a family. They have their own aspirations. Give fully of yourself to everybody you meet. And those are just a couple things I've learned.